you better should not be moved.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm J.M. Johnson, and I'm a member of the donor services team who helped produce today's event. Thank you for joining us virtually, and welcome. As we begin this event, we want to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of the various regions we're calling in from. A land acknowledgement is an important first step toward working with Native communities to partner with them in their stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. We take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathering on as we seek to undo the intentional erasure of Indigenous peoples. We honor the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Today, I am calling in from the traditional unceded territory and homelands of the Ohlone people. And recognizing the Indigenous stewards of this land feels particularly relevant as we think about today's topic of displacement and the challenges of being uprooted from community in the impending eviction crisis that we're going to be discussing. This program is part of our Meeting the Moment series, which is formulated in response to urgent events taking place around us, centering the leadership and voices of those in our community working to respond to those events. We're aiming to respond to questions from our donors and connect you with critical work that's supporting the Bay Area to realize its potential as an equitable and thriving community for all people. Though this virtual setting certainly leaves a lot to be desired in terms of our ability to connect and enjoy each other's presence, we're here to have a real conversation. So I'm inviting you to be on camera, even with your lunch in hand. Use the chat for questions, and we'll also try to provide space for verbal questions and bring your voices into the conversation as well. Our session is being recorded, so if you wish to be anonymous, but would still like to participate in asking a question of our guests, you can send those anonymously to me, the moderator. And a final logistical note, I just want to offer a special welcome to our brand new Chief Philanthropy Officer, Rahana Abbas, who is joining us during her first full week in her new role. So as you know, the Foundation's North Star is our equity agenda to advance racial equity and economic inclusion for everyone in the Bay Area. And in pursuing that agenda, the housing crisis here has been a centerpiece of our work. We have taken an all-in approach to addressing the housing crisis in the Bay Area through our various grant-making programs and initiatives. And it certainly seems like we've seen a lot of crises recently. We know that any crisis is going to hit some people harder than others because of the systems we have in our society that were set up intentionally to benefit white and wealthy folks over others. This eviction crisis is a racial justice issue because of those disparate impacts. But, and we'll talk about this today, donors have a great opportunity to make their dollars have a substantial impact by giving support in places and to groups who have been underinvested. So that's where I'm going to leave it, and I'm going to turn it over to our amazing guests to share their perspectives and insights from their work deeply rooted in the community. I'll drop their titles and bios in the chat in a moment, but just so you can get to know them a tiny bit as people and as friends in this work, I'll share one fun fact about each of them. So first, my colleague Christa from the Policy and Innovation team here at San Francisco Foundation is an avid coffee drinker. Ever since she worked the 4 a.m. shift at Starbucks in her high school and college days. Cheers to that. Melissa from the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, BARHI, has pursued executive doctorate studies as part of a United Nations cohort hosted in the Netherlands. And she's also seen this country a few times over, having done 3 cross-country road trips. Christina from Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, ACE, is, after a decade of running at least 1 half marathon a year, putting away her running shoes and taking up dancing on roller skates. Unfortunately, that won't be part of her presentation today, I don't think. And Monique from Centro Legal de la Raza is actually the great-granddaughter of Ernesto Nava, who passed away in 2009, who was the last living son of the Mexican revolutionary leader, Francisco Pancho Villa. So she says, it is no surprise that Monique loves eviction defense litigation. Welcome and thank you so much to our guests for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Christa to facilitate our conversation.
Thanks, JM. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you all. Thanks for joining during your lunch hour. I particularly want to thank Melissa, Monique, and Christina for joining us today, just a few days after the statewide eviction moratorium ended. So I know folks are very busy and this hour is really valuable. So a huge thank you for everyone joining us this afternoon. Before I turn it over to the conversation, I want to start with just a few pieces of context about the moment that we're in today. As you saw in the event invitation, despite 750,000 households across California being behind on rent, the statewide eviction moratorium ended last week on September 30th. While some localities across our region, like Alameda County, have longer local moratoriums in place, localities that didn't already have one on the books before state law changed are preempted from passing a new eviction moratorium, meaning that tomorrow, if San Jose wanted to pass a new eviction moratorium, they wouldn't be able to. So as of September 30th, tenants across our region are at a new risk of eviction. And while they're at risk, we also know we have a window to ensure that they get the support that they need. Tenants and landlords can apply for back rent using state and federal relief dollars. And while California has gotten out more money than most of the states in this country, it has not been fast enough or nearly enough to support residents across our region. As of last week, only 45% of those who were eligible for these rental relief dollars had actually applied. And of the $1.9 billion in applications, just over $500 million have been actually given out. Making sure folks apply for this rental relief dollars as soon as possible is critical to prevent evictions in this moment because it adds some additional court protections in the eviction process and supports both tenants and landlords to get the resources they need. As JM acknowledged at the beginning, we also know that the end of this eviction moratorium is a racial justice issue. Due to racial inequalities in our housing system, in our economic systems, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities are the most impacted across California and in our region. Across California, nearly 3/4 of the households that are behind on rent are households of color. We also know that these inequalities existed well before the pandemic and have become worse during the pandemic. For example, here in Alameda County, where I'm in, African-American residents make up just 11% of the population, but nearly 60% of people entering homelessness, and that was before this eviction crisis. We know the fallout of this moment in time has the potential to make this crisis so much worse, but we also recognize that we are in a moment, in a window. And what we do now can help define what our region will look like for years to come, what our homelessness crisis will look like, what diversity across our region will look like, and what families can afford to stay here and thrive here. And so with that, I am really excited to turn it over to our panelists and open up the conversation, both to talk about where we're at and what we can do as funders, as supporters to help. And so Christina, I'd love to start by turning it over to you to share a little bit of the context. How did we get here and what does an eviction cliff mean to you from your statewide perspective?
Sure, thank you, Christa. Good afternoon, everyone. First, please, I apologize for my voice. I'm a little sick, so hopefully we'll be able to get through it. I am the executive director of ACE statewide, so I'm based in Sacramento, but we do have 2 offices in the Bay Area, one in Oakland and one in Richmond, which does work across Contra Costa County. So let's just start with what does the eviction cliff mean? And then I'll go backwards. Because we have, for the last, maybe year and a half, been under a statewide eviction moratorium, which is not quite a moratorium. I'll talk about that in a moment. We have had some amount of protection for tenants across the state. And because those protections have gone away, not entirely, but in large part, and in different parts of the state, maybe more than in others, people are right at the brink of eviction. That's what we mean by the cliff, that at any moment, you know, several hundreds of thousands of people are actually like staring over the cliff into potential homelessness or displacement. And that is always a major crisis in terms of the communities that it's impacting, in terms of people's individual health and happiness, and stability, but particularly while the COVID pandemic continues on in California and across the country and across the globe, it's particularly dangerous for folks. So in terms of how we got here, even pre-pandemic, people were suffering from displacement, largely because of increases in rent. We had no protections in terms of, in most places, in terms of how high a rent increase could go. There were some efforts to, you know, put rent control into place in various parts of the city, in various cities across the state, excuse me. And there was an effort at the state level to repeal some of the restrictions around how strong rent control could be. But because of displacement, we were seeing people be forced out of their homes, not just because of like the high rent, but also because people knew they could charge more rent and there were no fault eviction protections in a lot of places. People were being displaced. So back in 20, I believe it was 18, we were able to pass a bill, maybe it was 19, that actually allowed for all across the state no fault evictions to be illegal. So people had to be evicted for a reason, and we got a rent cap in place. And then we hit the pandemic. So we were able pretty early on, after the first sort of legislative session, to pass a statewide moratorium, which really didn't, moratorium means no evictions at all, right? These, there were evictions that were allowed for Ellis. There were evictions that were allowed for habitability purposes. And those were actually pretty important to making sure that people could stay in their homes, coupled with the rent forgiveness that we've now been able to get for folks. At this point, that expired a couple of times and we got it renewed, facing the eviction cliff sort of every like 6 or 8 months. And we were sort of begging for there to be something that was a little bit more tied to the relationship of COVID and, you know, people being able to get back to work. And we have not been able to win that. So October 1st really was the deadline where we didn't have an extension. And at this point, non-payment of rent is moving forward, a totally evictable purpose. The state law that was passed said that no city could pass any sort of eviction protection for non-payment of rent beyond the date of that last bill that got signed. So in places like Oakland, where there was a very strong eviction moratorium in place, people were obviously in a much better position. But in other places, we can't actually get anything stronger around non-payment of rent. So we found from Friday to Monday, we just at ACE got somewhere between 80 and 90 people reaching out to us saying, I got an eviction notice, what do I do? That's, you know, one organization with just the people who sort of know that we do eviction work reaching out to us. So we know that, you know, starting Friday, evictions were put into motion almost immediately. That starts with a 3-day notice and then the eviction filings going in. And so what we know is that people right now who are not actually signed up for the emergency rental assistance funds have no protection against those evictions. And unless they're actually able to figure out what their rights are, get connected to lawyers, which there are not nearly enough of, I'm sure Monique can tell you that, we're gonna see people really being either forcibly put out through eviction, evicting themselves because they don't think that there's any chance of them winning the eviction, or being illegally locked out of their homes, which we have seen a huge increase in some parts of the state, particularly Los Angeles. And that is where, you know, folks go in and they remove the locks, remove all of the person's belongings and change the locks while they're like out picking up their kids or at the grocery store or something like that. And that's happening right now all the time. So we are really in this critical moment. And we have to figure out how we can make sure that folks really understand what their rights are, how they can get access to lawyers, how they can get connected to the emergency rental assistance program, and how we can sort of, as an organizing effort, make sure that at the state level, we actually do put strong protections in place long enough for us to really get through the worst fallout of the pandemic, both in terms of health reasons, but also people's ability to pay, so that we can work together on figuring out how we continue to get enough housing that's quality for people to live in the long run.
Thanks, Christina, both for that overview of how we got there and painting the picture of what it looks like statewide in this moment. Melissa, I'd love to turn it over to you to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the Bay Area. What do we know about who will be most impacted geographically, race, ethnicity, and share what you're seeing across the region?
Sure, happy to. Good morning, everyone. I'm Melissa Jones with BARHI. We're the coalition of the Bay Area's governmental public health departments. And so you've probably seen the health departments in the news a lot, focused on very early in the pandemic, some of the shelter at home decisions, right? The Bay Area, more than any other region in the state, and then certainly more than similar cities like New York, really did actions early that saved a lot of lives and prevented a lot of COVID cases. And so in the Bay Area, we're in a pretty unique position of having done some things early that made a huge difference on the loss of life that we've seen. And the pieces that you saw around shelter at home were part of it. But then the other piece is the piece that we do at BARHI, which is focused on the social determinants of health. So the other things that impact health, that impact how people experience things. And so one of the very early efforts that Christina just talked about was the eviction moratoriums. Pretty early on in that, there was a study done that really modeled what those moratoriums meant. And so we know that just between the initial period in November of 2020, that 186,000 COVID cases were prevented by the moratoriums and about 6,000 deaths. So it was a pretty big and important intervention. And it's an intervention that's mattered both for the big cities and for the smaller jurisdictions. When we started talking to people about and really looking at what the stressors were for housing, we knew from a pandemic perspective a couple of things. We knew that self-isolation was really important if people did contract COVID, to not have COVID spread disproportionately. And so there was a variety of things put in place on that. And then the other thing was making sure that people whose incomes had ups and down bumps, especially like hourly workers had up and down bumps really a lot, making sure that they were able to stay in their homes until there was this kind of relief available to them for the payment of rent. And so in the Bay Area, what that's meant, because of who's more in hourly work, because of a whole variety of other things, that disproportionately Black and Latinx renters were behind on rent, that they were often hourly workers, and 80% were households with children, and just working to manage through those losses. We know that there has been an incredible amount of work and need both in the cities and in the suburban communities. We actually did a report with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco to take a look at housing cost burdens before the pandemic. And that's when a lot of people were thinking about housing prices as being a big city thing, right? And we really were able to take a look to see what was going on and see that actually the housing cost burdens for families with children, especially families for young children, were high everywhere, including particularly high in Contra Costa and Solano counties. And that continues to be the places that have a lot of need in this moment around eviction protection. Now, the thing that, the other good thing that got put in place is this emergency rent relief. And so we really think there are 4 areas where emergency rental, where there could be really impact. And the next phase is just getting people really enrolled in the programs like Christina was talking about. There's the expansion of the debt relief and flexible financial assistance. And so if you could imagine being somebody in a moment of needing to figure out rent. Some people made choices. We all like figure out how are we gonna keep things going. And so some people made choices around different kinds of loans, like credit cards, payday stuff that actually aren't the kind of things you can get reimbursed through the federal program. And so there's some need for flexible resources so that people who have different kinds of debt related to housing can get that. There's some work around community education and organizing. And so the organizing is what makes sure people know that there's rent relief out there. It may seem, if you're following certain pieces of this, or you're really a housing person, I know some people in this room are really housing policy people, you know that there's rent relief. But if you're moving through your life every day, it's really hard actually that information is not pushed out in outlets that you're just walking by necessarily every day and know about. And so some of the work we've been doing in particular in Solano County with our partnerships there is really focused on making sure that word is out. And so when people are getting eviction notices, when people are behind, they know what's legal and not legal and what their rights are. There are a number of people who, when they get a notice, end up without housing because they don't know that there were other rights they had that they could have engaged. And you just don't necessarily know there's legal aids. You think attorneys are really expensive. I can't afford an attorney. There's a lot of information to get out there so people know. And then also the targeted outreach that I just mentioned and the funding of the legal services. So I'm sure Monique will talk about the difference between how likely a tenant is to be represented in a court proceeding versus a landlord. And then the last piece, I think, is just this focus on really having a focus on all the communities that are impacted, because there are some communities really that need both stronger networks to get information out to folks, and there are some holes in some places about who can access legal services because of the way they're funded. So for those of you who donate in the summer to Mayor's Summer Job Programs, you probably know there are funding streams that fund certain kinds of certain kids to get into summer jobs programs. And then the flexible private dollars fill the gap so every kid can get a job, right? But that's the design. And that's kind of the position we're in now too, is filling the gaps with the private dollars.
Thanks, Melissa. Monique, I'd love to turn it over to you and just, I know the statewide moratorium ended last week, Thursday. You all are on the front line in Alameda and Contra Costa across our region, seeing residents every day in the eviction process. If you could paint a picture for us, what are you seeing happening and what barriers are folks facing on the ground?
Thank you, Christa. Yes, it's been an intense week, intense year and a half, I'd say, for folks in the housing space. What we're seeing is mass confusion about what rights individual tenants have. You could have a tenant on one side of a street who may have a certain set of rights because of, city limits and borders, and their neighbor across the street may have an entirely different set of rights. Housing attorneys can barely navigate all of the different developments and the complexities. So individual tenants are confused right now. Again, I think Christina mentioned harassment, retaliation, self-help evictions. We are seeing that every day throughout the pandemic. We've seen the complaints that come to Centro Legal regarding illegal lockouts or retaliation or harassment have increased by 70% across Contra Costa and Alameda counties. I was just looking at our rental assistance data. 1 out of every 4 rental assistance applicants in Alameda County right now says that they have a real fear that their landlord might lock them out of their unit. So they are going to work every day. We are, on the phones telling people, when you go to work, when you go out to pick up your kids, make sure you keep a copy of your lease with you, keep your important documents with you, take your medications with you, because there's real fear that landlords will lock you out. And we are dealing with that every single day. Another interesting number I looked at is that 25% of the applicants for rental assistance in Alameda County report that they're ineligible for certain federal benefits, such as unemployment, which tells us that they're most likely undocumented. They've been unable to access other forms of rental assistance. And what we're seeing across the board from our undocumented clients is again, increases in retaliation, harassment. We have clients who call us and they say, they fear that they won't be eligible for rental assistance. They don't know what their rights are. So they are living in unacceptable conditions, cockroaches, lack of heat, or refrigerators not working, stoves not working, because folks fear that if they complain, they will be evicted and they have nowhere to go, and their industries have not come back, and they are way behind on rent and don't know that they're eligible for assistance. So there's a sense of desperation. I look in our tenants' rights email all day, every day, and it's just one desperate email after another from folks in Contra Costa and Alameda County. And same thing as, Christina mentioned, our phones are ringing off the hook right now of folks who think that they can be evicted. Their landlords are serving notices immediately. So that's, a little bit of what we're seeing on the ground. We're seeing also creative methods of circumventing the moratorium. And currently right now, the Alameda County moratorium is still in place until 60 days after the end of the local state of emergency. However, that has not stopped landlords from coming up with creative ways to circumvent the moratorium. For instance, restraining orders, landlords trying to take out restraining orders against tenants, or filing lawsuits against them in civil court or small claims court. Which is force legal service providers to kind of overnight try to figure out how to deal with these types of cases and learn an entire new area of law to be able to help tenants there in those spaces. And then I think, in terms of what legal service providers are doing right now in Alameda County and Contra Costa County in particular, which is where we provide tenants' rights services, so I can only speak to those two counties. We have, from day one, really just mobilized a network of legal service providers and our partner agencies to really be strategic in how we're going to deal with this eviction crisis. So from day one, we focused on prevention and then what our response was going to be once the moratorium lifted. In Alameda County, we have Alameda County Housing Secure, which is a network of legal service providers that's been in place since 2018. So we have an internal referral program, we do some emergency rental assistance, and we all provide legal services together in this network, all of the partner agencies. So when the pandemic came up, we were able to quickly mobilize and start to advocate for a moratorium in Alameda County. And we were successful in that advocacy because we were organized and we were able to pull folks together right away, build on the infrastructure and relationships, and get one of the strongest moratoriums in the country passed, which is what is protecting Alameda County tenants today. So that was one big prevention strategy. The next strategy was to partner with our county to integrate ERAP, this infusion of federal rental assistance dollars, into Alameda County Housing Secure. So Centro Legal is administering our countywide rental assistance through Alameda County Housing Secure. And what that's allowing us to do is to capture every tenant who is applying for rental assistance. We have them fill out a housing stability questionnaire where we ask them, do you worry that you're going to be locked out? Do you need repairs in your home? And then we can identify them and we can connect them either with Know Your Rights information, we can put them into a clinic, we can give them an appointment with one of our partner legal service providers to try to really prevent as many evictions as possible through the rental assistance program. So those are our big prevention efforts because we realize that no matter what, I can hire attorneys every day for the next month, but we'll never have enough attorneys to fight all of these cases in court. So we really need to focus on prevention. Although there will be a crushing number of evictions to defend. So we are also preparing to defend the crushing number of evictions. We have a few different strategies there. Throughout the pandemic, we've been partnering with law firms, law schools, volunteers to create self-help guides for tenants who are going to be able to navigate the system on their own and just need a little bit of support, right? That'll help us leverage our resources and focus our attorneys where they really need to be focused, which is helping the most vulnerable tenants who can't navigate the system, helping support entire buildings who are being evicted, or other cases which could impact policy change. The second thing we've done is we've created a series of workshops on Zoom and hopefully soon in person, where every week we were finding that we were getting hundreds of calls. 65 to 70% of those calls were from tenants asking the same question. I can't pay my rent, can I be evicted? Or I'm experiencing harassment because I'm behind on rent. What can I do? So every week we're able to funnel all of those tenants into one workshop where we can give a Know Your Rights presentation and then we can answer individual questions afterwards. We have law students, we have pro bono attorneys, and then we invite our organizer partners to every one of those workshops so that we can connect tenants to organizers to support them in the process going forward and to build community amongst tenants who are experiencing the same issues. Once the moratorium's over, our plan is to then transition those workshops into kind of a participatory defense model where we can provide tenants who are able, again, to navigate the system a little bit on their own, with a little bit of support. We can, have a workshop on how to do an answer, how to negotiate your own case in court, how to respond to certain demands from your landlord. Again, which will then help us to be able to leverage our capacity to have our attorneys do full scope representation where we can make the biggest impact and where we are needed the most. So again, I can talk about this all day, but I will stop, but that's what we're seeing on the ground and how we're preparing at Centro Legal.
Thanks, Monique. Both incredible work on the prevention and the response side. So just a huge thank you. Both you and Melissa really highlighted making sure tenants understand and know their rights as one of the most critical pieces in this moment in time. Understanding that someone who lives on one side of the street might have different rights than someone who lives on the other side based on where they live. And so Christina, I'd love to just turn it to you to talk about the role of tenant organizing, community outreach in this moment in time, what you're seeing in terms of best practices, and Melissa and Monique, welcome you to chime in as well, if you're seeing anything here in the Bay Area that you want to really lift up for folks on the call.
Sure. I think as Monique was saying, and maybe also Melissa was saying, the first part of organizing is really about the outreach piece, actually being in neighborhoods, really understanding like what's happening on the ground, even before folks, are being loud and clear about it. And what we're finding is that this is what we know, right? We know from many other examples, if it's electoral work or if it's the census work, that the power building organizations, the ones who are really rooted in communities, the folks that go out and knock on doors every day, they're the most trusted messengers, particularly for the folks who are most likely to be impacted by an eviction. And so being able to get out and knock on doors and say, this ERAP money is real, that you really can go and get your eviction stalled if you apply for this program. And that even if you are undocumented, you can still get this money. Sort of having people who can go out and say that is critical. And it's not just the organizers. I mean, as Monique said, I can hire 1 million, well, maybe not 1 million. I can hire as many organizers as I can afford to hire, and we're not going to have enough folks. But the good news about base building organizations is that we tend to have bases who are also really committed and willing to go out and spread the word to their neighbors, to their communities, through their networks. And that kind of word of mouth information that can be affirmed is oftentimes so much stronger than, some commercial that they might see that they're not sure, what that all means for them. So the outreach piece is really important. The thing about the organizing is you can do outreach and education about, protections that exist. Organizing is necessary to get more than what we have. And what we have right now is not enough. It is, in large part due to the organizing work on the ground and the groundswell in general around, the call to quote unquote cancel rent, which is how we got to the place where the federal government was really moving money to forgive rent in the first place. And where California went as far as saying we will forgive 100% of the rent. So the kind of organizing that's necessary to say, here is what your rights are, but also what more do you need so that we can say, here's what more we need to put in place to really stabilize communities is really critical. If we only get back to the place in housing where we were before the pandemic started, we have failed in our job to really protect people in their housing, because housing was a really unstable system in 2019. So we've got to be really looking forward. The positive part, I don't know if folks know Adrienne Maree Brown. She talks about organizing as science fiction. It's creating the kind of world that doesn't exist right now, but could exist, right? All structures are man-made and we can remake them. So it's really about doing enough organizing to get the kinds of policies in place that protect us well, but also help us dream up and actually create a much stronger housing system in the future that can protect particularly the vulnerable communities that we are, up against. And so I just want to say, the in-person outreach, the air war outreach, the support through people who answer phones to triage and give basic info, tenant clinics, organizing around rapid response. We have actually been able to save dozens of people from illegal lockouts by showing up once that person has been locked out and, you know, calling the press and calling the elected officials and, you know, demanding that the landlord return the keys. That is all possible if we've got the infrastructure in place to move people. I think a lot of folks in the Bay Area might really remember the Moms for Housing rapid response activation that pulled out, you know, hundreds of people on the streets when the eviction was imminent. Mind you, they still evicted and we still got that house. But there's that piece. And then again, the local policies. And I'll just say that there is one particular policy right now that we're really trying to make sure that the governor signs. This is on the C4 side, but if folks have, this is about like making sure that folks can get a right to counsel. And that's AB 1487. It's on the governor's desk. So if anybody is interested in just doing some personal advocacy and making that phone call, again, on the C4 side, we encourage you to do so.
Thanks, Christina, both for sharing the context and also reminding us that organizing is an investment, not just in this moment, but in the future that we're building together, and thinking about investing in organizing and community building and power building as an investment for our long-term success. Melissa, we're getting some questions in the chat and I wanted to direct this one to you. We're hearing a lot about the influx of money at this moment in time, federal money coming in, state money coming in, 100% of back rent being able to be paid. And so, you know, on the call, we have funders, we have philanthropy. What role can philanthropy play in this moment? And why is it important for us to supplement the federal and state money that's coming in the door?
Yeah, I guess there's two reasons. One is that as programs are being put together, especially on the community side and nonprofits, the private dollars that are donated are often more flexible, right? So they can do things that they can do things early while you're waiting for the government money to come in, which sometimes can come slowly, and they can kickstart your programs right away. The other thing they can do is fill gaps that otherwise the federal funding streams won't fill. And so, for example, they can make sure that clients who are undocumented have access to legal services. They can do more of the, sometimes they can do more of the organizing that people are talking about. So there are actually different needs that get filled by that money. The other thing is, and what we're seeing with a lot of the ARPA dollars, so those are the recovery dollars that are being awarded now by local governments to a variety of actions, is that there are a number of demands on those dollars. So for folks who were watching Alameda County's process to determine where they were putting their ARPA relief, the meeting that they hosted for the public to talk about the possibilities of what's needed in recovery lasted for 12 hours. 12 hours on 8 and 3-minute comment periods. So that's a lot of people with a lot of opinions about need, and you know, all of the needs are very real. When they did their allocations, a huge proportion of their allocations has gone to continuing the food programs that are the emergency food relief. And even with those allocations, they'll see that that money run at the end of December. So, I mean, there's a lot of different needs out there. And it's really important, I think, particularly for the housing needs as a fundamental and base kind of safety need for people, for there to be money that goes in that direction.
Thanks, Melissa. We have another question coming in on the chat and would encourage folks to add more questions as the conversation continues. Monique, I'd love to direct this one to you. The question is, what about landlords? We've heard from, you know, small landlords who have 1 or 2 properties who really rely on that rental income. You know, what's happening to them in this moment in time, and what types of support can they access?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, again, that has been a focus in Alameda County in particular with our rental assistance program. Small landlords who own 5 units or less get priority. They get to jump the line in terms of rental assistance, because we do want to make sure that we preserve our housing stock, particularly our rent-controlled housing stock, because, you know, once a tenant moves out of a rent-controlled unit, the landlord can reset the rent to any amount that they want it to be, and you permanently lose that rent controlled rate. And we also don't want to see what happened after the post foreclosure crisis happened, where speculators come in, corporations, they scoop up all of the properties, raise the rent, and become these absentee landlords, completely changing the characters of our communities. So from day one, we recognized that we needed to partner with small landlords, with the rental housing associations, to get this rental assistance out. In Alameda County, the housing department has entered into formal contracts with the rental housing associations to be ambassadors, to hold workshops explaining to landlords what their rights and responsibilities are under various moratoria, and to encourage them to participate in the rental assistance program. So they have been, our strange bedfellow in this process. Landlords and tenants are coming together to make sure that small landlords are able to access rental assistance.
Thanks, Monique. Another question coming in from the chat. Christina, I'd love to start with you, but then open it up to both Melissa and Monique. We have some donors on the call who are interested, in addition to giving, and we just put the give guide in the chat. What other ways can they support making sure folks get what they need in this moment in time? What other call to actions do you have for folks on the call?
Sure. So I'll just reiterate the first one. It's getting that right to counsel bill through. The governor would be very helpful. I think that it is always the case that we all have different audiences that respond to us. And I'm particularly well suited to speak to, the low-income communities that I'm working in. And I'm not as well suited to speak to, other audiences where people have influence either in what kinds of policies might move forward, or might just sort of also have, sort of a strong influencer role that they can play in terms of encouraging people to apply to the rental assistance program, et cetera. So the first thing in all organizing is just think about your personal network, who you know, what power, influence, or talents they have, and thinking about how to connect those people to this particular fight. If you wanted to sort of brainstorm ways to plug particular people in, I'm sure any of us would be totally happy to do that. And I would also say that one truth about organizing is that it's too often thought of as a particular issue focus kind of thing. And that's really not what organizing is about. It's about building power for individuals. And so what we really love to do is be able to make sure that folks who are directly impacted are face to face with folks who are pulling, strings and making decisions about their lives. And so if you wanted to help think about ways to put our tenants in front of people who who could actually be helpful in pushing their agenda forward, that's also a huge way that we're both empowering people to have control over their own lives and also influencing the kind of future housing that we get to develop.
Thanks, Christina. Melissa and Monique, anything you want to add to that in terms of ways folks on the call can support in addition to giving?
I can add just something that's been really interesting for me in this whole experience is different in-kind offers that folks have made of their skills or their expertise in this process. So, for instance, we have law firms that we're talking to, and we're encouraging them to loan out some of their first-year attorneys, maybe for a year or two, to help defend evictions. We have graphic designers who are reaching out to us and saying, can we help with some infographics to help explain what tenants' rights are? We have tech folks reaching out saying, how can we help you improve your rental assistance processes? Because those are all of the things that the federal funds do not cover, right? There's a very small 10% administrative fee in all of these rental assistance and ERAP and, federal funds. So it's this innovation and, scaling and all of that kind of support has been immeasurable. And it's not necessarily just dollars, it's just people, brain power. So that I would encourage that.
Thanks, Monique. Really glad. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
I was going to just pick up on what Christina said and say, in thinking about your network, there are also places that have seen much less giving in the region. And so those include Contra Costa and Solano counties. And so as you're thinking about your network and people who care about those communities and those places, it's really helpful if you can start to connect folks with, and we're happy to help broker some of that with community groups out there who are getting the word out, who are helping people with rental assistance, because it's really important, and there's a lot of work to do there.
Thanks, Melissa. Glad to hear folks are stepping up in these kind of ways. And in the vein of getting the word out about what folks' rights are, Monique, I wanted to turn it over to you. We've got some questions on the call, just wanting to understand, if you're a tenant in this moment in time who might be behind on rent, what are your rights? Kind of what do you tell people broadly in terms of both the process and what their rights are in this moment in time?
Yes, great question. And yes, I've been remiss. Usually I start out every single time I speak somewhere with a summary of what the tenant's rights are so that I can create more ambassadors out there for information. So in Alameda County right now, as I mentioned earlier, the local eviction moratorium is still in effect until 60 days after the end of the local public health emergency as declared by the Alameda County Public Health Officer. So right now, the only evictions that are proceeding in court are evictions where there's an Ellis Act, which means that the landlord just wants to remove the entire property from the rental market and go out of the business of being a landlord. Cases where a unit maybe has been red tagged, deemed unlivable by some type of government agency, or evictions where the tenant is an imminent threat to the health and safety of other tenants at the building. And in Alameda County, our courts have created a very high barrier for giving those summons and complaints out to tenants. So very few evictions are actually getting past the gate right now in Alameda County. However, I will say, in the tenants' rights community in Alameda County, we are cautious. There have been legal challenges to various moratoria throughout the state. Alameda County's case is yet to be tested. Alameda County's moratorium is yet to be tested in court. And we, kind of feel like we had some cover through September 30th while the state moratorium was in place, but now we are waiting any day for potential legal challenges. We are confident that it will stand up to challenge, but it's uncertain. This is, brand new area, new territory. So right now we have the floodgates, we're holding them up like this, and we're hoping they last. Contra Costa, different story, as Christina mentioned, but there are not similar local protections, so non-payment of rent evictions can proceed. So the important thing is to make sure that tenants, even in Alameda County, we're encouraging tenants to comply with the state law and apply, because in the event that the local moratorium gets overturned, at least they'll still have those state protections. So no matter what, every tenant behind on rent should get in the application system for rental assistance so that they can be protected from eviction for non-payment of rent. Beyond that, it gets a little nuanced, so I would encourage folks to reach out to a tenants' rights agency if they have other questions related to back debt or future rent or other types of evictions. But number one thing is get your application in for rental assistance.
Thanks, Monique, really helpful. And I'll put the link to the statewide application for rental assistance in the chat in a moment. Feel free to share that with your networks, and would encourage Christina and Monique and Melissa and other folks as well to share any resources they're amplifying with their networks in this moment in time when it's so critical to make sure folks understand what their rights are. Christina, another question that came in the chat that I'd love to direct to you. Curious to think about, right now we're in a moment of crisis or potential crisis as the floodgates are starting to open, and as Monique said, folks are really trying to hold the line. But we also know many of you are starting to think about the longer term vision and how we can really create the organizing and momentum in this moment to look long term. And just curious to hear from you really what you're seeing long term and what that vision looks like. As you were saying in the science fiction, creating our new reality, what reality are you working to create?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I don't know if folks are aware of a term that's been floating around, social housing. This is sort of a reimagining of public housing. Public housing is a stigmatized term, and stigmatized for good reason, right? We know that public housing, once Black and Brown and Indigenous folks really started to move in, have been underinvested in and been allowed to sort of fall into disrepair and become a place where nobody really wants to raise their families. But that is not to say that there is not a way for us to really think about housing for the commons in a futuristic kind of way that means that we are putting our public investment into creating housing that actually truly is affordable for everyone at any, income point that your family has, and is also of a quality that anybody would be proud to raise their family in. And some of that is around constructing new housing. Some of that is around actually just protecting the existing affordable housing stock that we have. We look at the Oakland Land Trust as one place where we've really seen some innovation and success in moving housing from the speculative market into public hands. Sometimes that's through co-ops. Sometimes that's through putting it in land trusts and in other public entities. And sometimes it is, actually thinking about private housing that has different standards around the relationship between landlords and tenants, and really recognizing the symbiotic nature of the relationship there, and balancing not just, sort of what is the maximum value that we could extract from the rental of that unit, but really like what is the maximum value that we can contribute to the community when we're thinking about how that unit is really situated. So there's a lot of really interesting, thinking going on there. It will require some significant investment to figure out how we really fund a public housing system. But, community members are sort of digging in and really trying to define what that looks like and be on the ground floor of shaping it moving forward.
Thanks, Christina, for grounding us in that longer term vision. Before I turn it back over to JM, I just wanted to give each of you an opportunity to say a final closing word, what folks can do to support you in this moment, what you're paying attention to, and your call to action for us. Melissa, I'll start with you and then go to Monique and end with Christina.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for taking the lunchtime today to be here and talk about this issue. It's, this has been such a long 2 years. It has been just exceptionally long. And I think the challenge has been this nature of the rolling nature of COVID-19, and how we've had these ups and downs of how much it's happening at any given time, and the variants, and so much misinformation out there about both COVID and what's available to people to support them in this time. And so, I think that our call to action would be really to support local agencies that are doing the work of getting that people-to-people information out there so people can hear there is rental assistance. That's not a scam that it's rental assistance. That's there. You can access it. There are resources for you to get legal services. That's there. You can access it. It's just so important to health. I know oftentimes you don't think of health departments thinking about that, but there's a whole range of strategies that we've used during the pandemic to keep rates lower. And they have, and many of them are housing strategies. So thank you for taking the time today.
Yeah, echo all of that. And, as Christina mentioned, this has been eye-opening. This entire experience of the pandemic. Another world is possible. In Alameda County, there are, I think, maybe 25 evictions in the first 9 months of the pandemic, compared to when there were 25 a week prior. We never thought a world without evictions could exist. And look, it has for a year and a half, and the sky has not fallen. What would it be like if instead of the sheriff coming to evict a family, a team of social workers came to support them and find a transition plan and connect them with services? So now is the time. This is the largest infusion of federal funds in my entire lifetime. We are building up these safety networks. We are changing the conversation, the narrative, changing the paradigm. What I would encourage folks to do is kind of think long-term. What's going to happen when these federal emergency relief funds go away? We've all built these amazing infrastructures. We are building this people power. How can we leverage these federal funds to create something bigger and better and bolder that's going to last into the next generation? So I want to encourage folks to think big and think about how we can make this work sustainable.
Again, just thank you all for taking your time to be here today. I want to say that housing right now is not an issue that only groups that focus on housing are paying attention to. It is an issue that is anybody who sort of organizing a base or who has clients is hearing about, because so many people are in danger of losing their housing, or are spending all of their money on housing and therefore are falling into disrepair in other places of their lives. And to that, I want to let you all know that ACE has pulled together an action center. We're calling it the No One Leave Action Center. And it's particularly for groups who are not focused on housing, not steeped into the housing work, to get sort of baseline information and resources for folks that they come into contact with. And we're willing to do, sort of legal briefings for folks. We're willing to do tenants' rights for folks, or have people send their, clients to our tenants' rights workshop. We're getting materials out, sort of know your rights cards. We'd love to print them up in multiple languages and just ship them out to people. So we are looking for ways to resource that particular set of work so that we can get, as much information into the hands of power building groups as possible. And if folks are interested in helping to support that, we would love to talk more about it. But I want to say more broadly than anything that what my biggest worry is that the sort of housing fatigue is going to set in. Right. I did organizing work around foreclosures, and, just as the worst of it was over, people were sort of like, I just don't want to hear about housing anymore. Unfortunately, housing is such a baseline necessity in people's lives that we cannot afford to get fatigued on the issue. So I just really want to encourage folks to think about that, as I'm sure that you will hear over and over again lots of ways that you can support the housing work, but that it really is one of the most fundamental pieces that, if we strengthen for people, can change their lives in just transformational ways. And that base building and organizing is a way to make real inroads on this and several of the other issues, because we've gotten so much better at sort of our ways of thinking about the intersections between health and housing, between housing and immigration, between immigration and policing, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are going to fall into the housing fatigue, please don't fall into the fatigue of supporting power building groups.
Thanks everyone for both the incredible work and for those calls to action. I wanted to just underscore the comments that what we do in this moment will impact all of us. What homelessness will look like in our region, what diversity, art, and culture will look like in our region, and what our region will look like long-term. And so with that, I want to say thank you to our panelists and turn it over to JM to close us out.
Thank you, Christa. Thank you, panelists. You've made it so clear that it's in everyone's best interest to avoid this wave of evictions. And I couldn't help but shake the kind of inspirational feeling that you were providing in describing how the outreach and organizing process through this response can build power in a way that makes another world possible, which is just a really beautiful vision for how we turn this moment into something good. I also heard that the private dollars that our donors can provide are more flexible than the government resources. They can kickstart important work and fill gaps that the government can't fund. And in that spirit, our team has prepared some giving recommendations, which you can find in the chat. Will also be emailed out afterwards. And the organizing, outreach, and direct service providers in that give guide all help ensure that people are aware of how to apply for the resources that are available. And we want to ensure that everyone knows about those resources. And there are people who those resources won't cover. And that's one of the reasons why flexible philanthropic dollars are so critical in this moment. Invite everyone to complete the evaluation that's also in the chat. Would love your feedback about future events. And just one final thank you to our guests for being so deep in the work, for helping our community, and to our donors for your time and your consideration of how you can help meet this moment. Be well, take care.